Yeah, I think they got string girls. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a favor. One of you go and buy a burger of water. I'm sure I
There's you upstairs.
can hear you. Is there a machine upstairs?
I think so, but not in front of the bookstore.
Okay. Whenever you get back.
Okay, I'll get you to it.
My friend Meg's supposed to be here, but I don't see her.
Might not be much of an AV guy, but.
I didn't know if there was. What was the one upstairs?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Check the live channel thing and I don't know if that actually stops after an hour. Well, it's gonna be good, but got this anyway, right? I didn't realize that.
Is there a way to fix it?
Fix what?
I don't know.
I don't think there's any extending it.
I'm not sure if it'll let us how far we'll run over.
I don't know.
It'll be okay. Yeah, exactly.
I guess that's your parking. It sounds like a lot. You basically spend them out over that process. Yeah, the first thing is when you're like scary, but then you realize you can't say it all. Yeah. Well, that's the coming here. Right now, it's the first couple. Yeah. Yeah, because the audience doesn't miss what I'm saying. They just want to get.
Yeah. Get used to talking.
Yeah, and that's why was there.
Well, yeah, usually actually.
Yeah, no, I get your personality.
I got used to talking to people. I started teaching. So I'm like, hey, take yourself here, something like that.
So I'm an education major, I'm having that kind of this wonderful.
Oh, do you have presentations?
Actually taught a little bit on Monday.
Oh,
I did
in
video.
high school? Oh, how's it feel like? I thought just like 4 years old.
It's not terribly bad the first time. My parents were big fans.
Oh, let's see how it looks. Yeah.
Sugar set. Same spot.
Well, all right, guys. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Caitlin Waits. I'm the president of Secular Student Alliance here at UNA. And I am so honored to be able to introduce our speakers, Dan Barker from the Freedom from Religion Foundation and Dr. Joel Anderson. He is one of our professors of religion. And I'm going to invite them up to tell you guys a little bit about themselves. Give them a hand.
All right. So here we go. Okay. Don't want to put water on an electronic device. All right. Hi, I'm Joel Anderson. I'm an adjunct here at UNA, and I've been given a minute to tell you a little bit about myself. I taught for 16 years at the high school level in various schools in California, Arkansas, Alabama. Taught English, as well as my graduate degrees are all in biblical studies, New Testament master's degree, Old Testament master's degree, PhD, Old Testament. So I've done that, and the last few years I've been here at UNA doing a lot of the religious studies courses, primarily the Old Testament courses, an occasional New Testament course. I also have, and good segue into the slideshow. I didn't know when to put this in, so I want to explain a couple things. A little bit more about me. Oh, look at that. Beautiful. Okay. Not to sound like it's like a promotion or anything, but this is actually kind of fun. I wrote a couple years ago a book called The Heresy of Ham about the creation evolution debates. If you want to know what that is, you probably guess what it might be. I wrote that a couple years ago. And when I was told I was going to get to do the debate, they thought, we're going to have a table and we're going to have some, so you could put some books. So I thought, I'll order a few. They haven't come in. So what I have on the table, I have if you think it's interesting, if I impress you today, you can write your name and email out, when I get them. And you can order them off of Amazon, but I'll have a bunch. And then this, moved over. And then this one is coming out in about a week. It's Christianity, the Revolution and Worldviews in Western Culture. Again, I was hoping to have that done and published, printed out by today. There was a couple editing problems, so it won't come out until next week, so I don't have those either. But if you want to write your name down, I'll get it over the top. As for the other two, this is actually kind of funny. I was telling my parents about doing the debate and we're gonna have books out. And my dad said, "Hey, maybe you should just buy a couple purchase a couple of books about these two. I kind of just self-published, like some funny teaching stories from my. If you're a student teacher and you're freaked out about student teaching and teaching early stuff, this will make you laugh. It has nothing to do with this debate, but I think it's kind of funny. So I bought a few of those, and then my dad said, we really like your poetry. So buy a few poetry books. It has nothing to do with this. So I bought a few of those. Those came in. So what are you going to do? And then the second thing, just another thing, just to brag on, more self-publication thing. I translate for fun in the hobby, and you can get these on Amazon here too. Basically, it's my translation of the New Testament, the Old Testament. That's what I do for fun. So there might be a typo or two. All right, ready to go?
Okay, yep, and
Oh, okay. You do your intro first, and then I'll.
Is that it? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I used to be a Christian minister. I preached for 19 years, Bible believing, and the second coming of Jesus and all of that. And then I changed my mind. I tell the story in my book, Godless, how an evangelical preacher became one of America's leading atheists. And the reason I changed my mind was not only did I learn that Christianity is not true, I realized that there's no good coherent definition of a God. There's no good evidence for a God. There's no good argument for a God. Bertrand Russell said these arguments are all just really bad grammar is what they are. There's no agreement among believers about the nature or the moral principles of this God. They're all fighting with each other, and they can't even get their act together on it, or the religions of the world. There's no good reply to the problem of evil. There's a number of theodicies out there, but the problem of evil, there really is no good reply to that. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there's no good God. These children are dying at the same rate as random, uncaring chance. And there's no good reason to trust the reliability of the holy books like the Bible or the Quran or the others. The Bible is contradictory, unscientific, in many cases unhistorical, and primarily immoral. The teachings of the Bible are really grossly immoral. I wrote a whole book about that. And then finally, there's no need for a God. There's tens of millions of good people in this country who lead happy, fulfilled, loving, joyful, purposeful, meaningful, good lives. Number 135. So maybe I can get to 150 pretty soon. So thank you.
that would be exciting. All right, thank you.
All right, for question number 1, we've got Dr. Anderson beginning, and the question is morality derived from a transcendent standard?
I've told a few of you before we started, what I'm worried about is the first 2 questions. I've spent too much time on the first 2 questions and not enough time on the 3, 4, and 5. So we'll see if I get through everything I want to get through. All right, wow, that is big. All right, so is morality derived from a transcendent standard? Now, first off, and I have to say, I've read your book, so I have an idea of what you're going to say. I'm going to agree up front. I do not think that the Bible, the Torah, is the root, the cause, what I say here, does not provide, the Bible itself does not provide the transcendent rule book for everyone. I think that is a wrong way to understand what the Bible, and specifically the Torah, is. Because you know how things go whenever you have a modern controversy, a moral controversy. On one hand, you'll have more of a fundamentalist say, well, it says in Leviticus, blah, 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 blah. And then somebody else will say, well, it also says in Leviticus, don't eat shellfish. How about that? Take that. And they just kind of argue verses back and forth. Both views, when it comes to understanding the Torah, is they're misunderstanding what the Torah is in the first place and what the purpose of the Bible is. So I'm going to try to touch upon that in a minute. The second thing I want to point out very clear, if you've read some new atheists and such, let's skip down to the second one. One of the claims is they tried to say that morality is derived from evolutionary theory. Now again, to be clear, I think evolution by and large is a valid scientific theory. It talks about the natural processes that give rise to the various differences in species, physical, material beings. But But to point to evolution, to try to explain the non-material concept of morality, and we'll probably talk about this a little later, I think there's a fundamental disconnect. If it is about the change in material species, to point to that to try to explain something non-material like ideas of right and wrong, I don't see how you can get from there to there. So we'll probably talk about that a little later. For what we know regarding morality, in my opinion, is I think it's pretty unique to human beings. Yes, there's you could look at chimpanzees and lions and say there's elements of altruism when they care for their young, but no one is going to look at a lion in the Sahara tackling a gazelle and eating out the gazelle and say, boy, that is an immoral lion. We don't do that. But if I did that to another person, you would call me immoral or crazy. So the very idea that we don't ascribe to the rest of the natural world, the things we clearly ascribe to each other, to me, that is something unique about human beings. As far as where that comes from, that's where we get to start, in my opinion. All right. Now, next slide, please. All right, to understand the whole topic of morality, you have to take the big picture of things. In fact, most discussions of debates about morality often are taken in context of, or go along with debates about reality. If you know anything about the history of Western philosophy and stuff, I'm going to take you on a very brief tour. I don't know if I can get through it all. You can go back to the Greeks. You know, go back to Plato and Aristotle. Everybody know Plato's allegory of the cave vaguely? Yes, awesome. Okay, if you go back to the ancient Greeks, they viewed, and there's a picture of, if you can see it, they viewed the material world as the less real of reality. The real is the world of forms. And therefore, the way we can ascertain what is true and what is right and what is moral in this shadowy world of materialism, you need to contemplate the world of forms, which is non-material. So in the Greek view, the true real is the non-material. The material world is less. That was the general view. Okay, so it's not just a Christian view, it's been around for all philosophy. When you go to Old Testament, though, Israel did not share that kind of dualistic mindset, worldview. And this is where I gotta teach you something about the Torah a little bit. If you want to understand the Torah, anybody ever tried to read the Torah? Like all the weird rules? It's kind of weird if you don't know what you're talking about, if you don't know what it is. To understand the Torah, to be straightforward, it's not a rule book. It's not codified law in the sense that we think of law today in our Western civilization. Okay? To understand what the Torah is, you have to understand a little bit about the ancient Near East. And basically, in the ancient Near East, basically what the Torah is, you have to see it in light of the suzerain vassal treaty. That's what the covenant is. In the ancient world, if a large, famous, not wealthy, powerful king wanted to make basically a contract with a lesser vassal, they would enter into an agreement, and they would have stipulations. You do this, and I will protect you, and you bring glory to me. And it was kind of a two-way street. Think of it kind of like a licensing agreement, like LeBron James signing with Nike. Is it Nike? Okay, it's an agreement. He wears their stuff, and his greatness points to Nike, and Nike benefits from it, and in return, they promote him, and it's kind of a two-way thing, okay? A suzerain vassal treaty is kind of like the same thing between a suzerain and a vassal, okay? And normally in the ancient world, it happened between an earthly king and another earthly lesser king. The unique thing about the Torah is that it claims to have made this treaty with a god, which that's very unique in the ancient world. We don't even think about that. But the way it's set up, primarily in Deuteronomy, is it's not that God just says, okay, here's some rules, you better obey them or I'm going to send you to hell. That's not the way it's set up. They are stipulations that ancient Israel agreed to be, and they would be identified with Yahweh, and Yahweh would protect them, and they would live their lives according to this order. Now, a lot of the rules, lack of a better word, what we find in the Torah is very similar to other law codes that you see in the ancient Near East. Much of it is very much the same. And it's not necessarily dictating moral legislation. It's just a way to order the ancient society, okay? So the unique thing about the Torah is not that it somehow gives these magic rules to this is perfect morality that we're going to legislate. It is, the unique thing is it's set within them identifying themselves up with a particular God, okay? But the thing you have to remember, it's not codified legislation like we think of today. We're already two? Oh, man. Okay, I told you it's going to be long. It's a different way of understanding the law. The ancient world did not have codified legislation. What it was basically is it was a way of teaching by models. A lot of things you see in the Torah is to teach the rulers and the kings and the judges what justice would kind of look like in the ancient Near East. Okay, it's not trying to dictate morality. It's trying to give an example of what would bring about good rule. So the judges would have wisdom to then turn around and rule in various cases. All right. But the point is, it wasn't what the law code back then, it wasn't what we think of it today. There's a lot more to that, but I gotta move on. Okay. I think I'm only gonna get to the New Testament. All right. Next slide. Yes. Okay. Now this is kind of really quick. We're gonna skip to, well, not gonna skip. By the time you get to Jesus in the New Testament, you have to understand what was going through the Jew, what happened with the Jews. They had gone into exile, they'd come out of exile, and they expected when they came out of exile that God would restore them, a new Messiah, and they would rule, and it never happened. Okay? And so therefore, in intertestamental Judaism, there's a sect called the Pharisees, and they began to tweak their understanding of the Torah, and it's basically this: why hasn't God fulfilled his promises to us after the exile? It's because we're not keeping the Torah well enough. And this is where, and we all could understand this, it gets to the mentality of if we keep the Torah rules, then God will like us more, and then he'll keep his promises. That very legalistic mindset that we call Pharisaic. That's where it came from. That was the mindset that when Jesus came and Paul went out to the world, that they were dealing with. Okay? Let me skip that. And so what you see here is in the Gospels when Jesus, his treatment of the Torah, when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, or when you look at his speaking about the Golden Rule, when you read it closely, he's not giving extra rules. He's basically saying the whole point of the Torah is to teach you wisdom to truly be God's people, to love one another. Okay, he wasn't about articulating every single solitary rule. And then when you get to Paul, and I'm doing a Paul class right now, he goes to town on what he calls the Judaizers, who were really trying to emphasize rule keeping. And Paul's point is, if you think to obey rules, you're going to impress God, you're misunderstanding what the Torah is. And I'm going to have to stop now, so I'll try to come back to this in the conversation. I knew this was too much. All right, sorry.
Dan? I'll repeat the question, and that is morality derived from a transcendent standard?
So too bad Joel didn't get to the end of his presentation, because we don't know if he's going to say yes or no to that question. My answer is no. Morality is not derived from a transcendent standard. Of course, that word transcendent is kind of a slippery word. You can use it in different ways. Metaphysically, you might say transcendent would be some supernatural, above the natural world kind of thing, like where gods and things live. But you can also use the word transcendent in a natural sense, like strategy transcends tactics, or music theory transcends music composition. And in that sense, we're not talking about a supernatural world. We're talking about ideas that transcend other ideas. So is morality derived from a transcendent standard? If you mean transcendent in the metaphysical sense, no, it's not, because it's not there. And even Joel seems to be hinting that the Bible is not a standard for morality. It may contain some moral truths, but it's not, and we'll talk about that later. But I think morality is not top down. You don't look for a command, because if you do look for commands, or a list of rules like the Ten Commandments for that. Well, how do you know those commands are moral? What does moral actually mean? What do we mean by morality? What are we even talking about when we talk about morality? I think morality boils down to one simple word. You want to think about what morality is? The word is harm. We judge actions by how much harm they deliberately cause or minimize. So in my book, Mere Morality, I define morality as acting with the intention of minimizing overall harm. And harm, whatever it is, you can make a big list of what harm is. Hunger, thirst, the elements, natural disasters, disease, predation, inequality. You can make a long list of whatever it is that threatens to harm us as human beings. Whatever it is, it's natural. It's a natural thing. It's not something that's supernatural. It's where we live our lives. And we all judge people by how much harm they're committing or not, or avoiding. We judge religions by how harmful those religions are to other human beings. We would judge a religion that is genocidal to be less moral than a religion that is pacific. I think we would all, and we're using principles here. We're not using some top-down command, here's what thou must do. What are we doing when we judge religions? Suppose we were to put all the religions of the world like on a buffet table. Let's look at this one and this one. Let's pick the best one. You would use some kind of a standard of picking what is the best religion and which ones are bad. What is that standard? What that standard is transcends the religions themselves. You are using a natural secular standard for judging those religions, and that standard, I think, is harm. It's not top down, it's bottom up. So if harm, and even psychic harm is physical harm, it's natural harm. Even hurting someone's feelings is a physical harm. If harm is natural, and the follows that the avoidance of harm, or the minimizing of harm, because we can't always avoid it. We're biological organisms in a natural environment, and so we bump into things, and there's going to be some harm in our lives. We can't avoid it altogether. But the avoidance of harm is a natural exercise. It's not a supernatural exercise. It's not a transcendent thing. And so morality doesn't come from rules or lists or commands. It comes from principles. And what are those principles? Principles would be natural principles of minimizing harm by evaluating the relative merits of the consequences of your available actions. You're looking at this action versus this action. And what are you doing when you evaluate them? You're looking at the harm they cause or the harm that they eliminate. And then you're judging morally whether this is a good action or not. That's what we mean by morality. We don't need a code for that. We don't need a religion for that. In fact, I think most Christians are good people. I think most Muslims are good people. Most Jews are good people. How can I say they're good people? I say it by a standard that transcends those religions, not in the supernatural world, but that transcends them in the principle judging all of those religions or all of those people. So in my book, Mere Morality, I talk about how do you judge whether something is harmful or not? And I came up with the 3 moral minds. Have you ever seen one of those cartoons where the character has a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, and is looking back and forth? What should I do? Should I do what I want? Should I do what I should? That's kind of silly, but I propose a model where we picture, instead of a devil and an angel, picture on one shoulder instinct, and on the other shoulder law, and in the middle reason. And now abideth instinct, law, and reason, but the greatest of these is reason. Instinct is past judgment from past minds. Your ancestors made decisions, and because of those decisions, they were more likely to pass on their genes to you and me. We have inherited from them some of their past decisions. For example, if you see a baby falling, you reach over and try to catch it. That actually happened to me once in the Detroit airport. I caught a baby just before it fell to the hard floor. I wasn't evaluating it by some moral philosophy. I wasn't thinking through how can I be a good Christian or atheist. I was just instinctively acting. And many of us have instincts that are altruistic, like we share with other primates and other animals. Sometimes the instincts are bad because they're firing in a new environment. So instinct is not always right. Law is the same thing. Law is the result of the collective mind of the society in which you live. Laws can be good, especially if you live in a humanistic society. Laws can be bad. So how do you evaluate these minds of yours? You use reason in the middle. And using reason, which is a bottom-up principle, you look at the actions, you look at the available actions, and you say, well, which of these results in the least amount of harm? I call that the harm principle. The Bible is a bad moral guide. Joel hints that it's not even a moral guide at all, so maybe it's unfair to accuse it of being a bad moral guide when it's not even pretending to be. And yet most Christians think the Ten Commandments are some kind of, they want to post them in the schools. If Joel is true that the Old Testament is not really a good moral guide, then we should reject most of it. We should throw out most of it. We should throw out the Ten Commandments. The Bible nowhere uses the word morality or ethics. You won't find that word anywhere in the Bible. And I think one of the best ways to try to look at what the Bible considers to be good actions or moral actions is to look at how it uses the words evil and wicked. If you go through the Old Testament, evil and wicked appear about 1,000 times, roughly, depending on which English translation you use. And more than 90% of the time, I think more than 95% of the time, when those words are used, which is, in other words, this is the God of the Bible or those Israelites telling us what you should not do, which would be a guide for moral decisions, about 95% of the time, they have nothing at all to do with human-to-human behavior, what you and I would call moral things. Once in a while, you'll see things about taking care of the widows and avoiding a drunken son. You'll see a few things here and there, but generally, the words evil and wicked have to do, well, the biggest one is idolatry, not worshiping this God. There's this covenant in Deuteronomy about you should follow him and he'll bring blessings, and if you don't, here's all these curses, kind of like a possessive, abusive husband who says to his wife, I love you, you love me, you don't look at anyone else, I'm your Lord, and if you look at anyone else, I'm going to pull your hair out and burn you, and I'm going to spray dog poop on your face. I'm not making this up. The Bible says that. There are all these curses and pestilences and fire and bloodthirstiness that this God just threatens over and over. Obviously, it's a mythical creature and is a fictional character. But idolatry is not a moral principle. Idolatry is offending the ego of the husband, the father figure, who's not being worshipped and loved as much as he wants to be. The other one, after that comes the Sabbath, not worshiping on the Sabbath. After that comes interracial marriage or interreligious marriage. Don't marry the other tribes. And we see what happens when that happens. Phinehas, the grandson of the high priest Aaron, actually thrust a sword and killed a mixed race couple because God said you should keep the nation pure. The Israelites should stay with one God. And he was praised. He was rewarded for doing that. That's not morality. This is sort of a perverse kind of monster system of thought. Yes, morality seems to be unique. I don't think morality is unique to human beings, but I think moral philosophy is unique to human beings because we are social animals. And Jesus, if the Bible were a good moral guide, by the New Testament, we should have reached a moral arc through history. And Jesus should have arrived and said, okay, listen, this is the New Testament now. This is going to be better than what came before. Jesus had a huge missed opportunity. What he should have done and what he could have done is he should have said, hey, people, I apologize for my dad. He was a violent, sexist, brutal jerk. Look at his actions. Look at his threats. Look at the way he lived. But he didn't do that. He went on to say, he who had seen me had seen the Father. I and the Father are one. He quoted his Father with approval. He never denounced the slavery, the slave mongering, or the misogyny, or the sexism, or the brutality, or the bloodshed of his Father. He quoted him with approval. Therefore, he was continuing that same mentality that there is a higher up alpha male, big man boss over us that we all have to submit to. Otherwise, like an abused, scared wife, we're going to be really beaten senseless. And in the New Testament, of course, that translates to hell. And I think any system of thought or morality that contains a threat of punishment, temporal or eternal, is a morally bankrupt system. Morality does not come from a transcendent source. It comes from the natural world in which we live.
All right, that's time. Now we'll have an 8-minute rebuttal period.
I guess I'll start.
Okay,
What does that mean? 4 minutes each? Or?
I don't know, I'll say something, you say something, we'll just kind of see how it goes.
Oh, it's a back and forth?
Yes.
Is that right? Back and forth?
It's a rebuttal period,
Okay.
for you guys to just
Oh, okay,
comment
good.
on what you said.
I'll just make a few brief comments and stuff. First off, much of what you said about Torah and moral and that I also love user like God. That whole view is what I said, that's not the way the Torah should be understood. So, and again, one of the problems I find when I read a lot of atheist critique of the Bible is they don't take time to understand the context of what, like I said, the Suzerain Vassal Treaty is.
But it's not just atheist critiquing, it's also believers who make some of the same critiques.
Well, yeah.
It's not just an atheist critique of the Bible.
Well, you do see the direct critique in Richard Dawkins,
Yeah, there are many atheists.
The direct.
Yeah.
And but it gets down to the fact that people don't. Unfortunately, even in Christian circles, comes from a misunderstanding of what the Torah is, and that's a whole different issue. But what I was trying to get at is the point of the Torah is not here are the rules to keep or you go to hell. The point of the Torah is to teach wisdom, to grow people up to maturity so that they can be well-adjusted, moral people. Now, yes, we all have a sense of morality. How can I put this? If you think the Torah is just rules to keep to avoid hell, that is a very, and unfortunately, a lot of Christians have this view. That is a very childish view. It's the kid who says, Daddy, I brush my teeth. I'm a good boy. That kind of idea. If you're a mature person, you know your parents' love for you is not dependent on whether you have to keep one or two rules. And so I'll say one more thing.
But so what good is the Torah? What is its relevance to us today if it's just for those ancient?
Well, first of all, the Torah is the heart of the covenant of the Old Testament Israel. The Torah is not meant to be a universal rule book. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that.
So for you and me, should we ignore it?
No.
What is its value? For this question, what is the value of the Torah?
Well, the Torah's point is not here are moral rules to follow to be a good person. The purpose of the Torah is to identify the people of Israel with a particular God so they can then bear witness to who he is to the world. Again, there's a lot more to it than that, but you can't reduce it to simply these are rules to keep to avoid hell.
So it's for the Israelites only.
Yeah, the Torah is.
So it's not for us.
The Old Covenant, right?
So it has nothing to do with you and me.
Well, I mean, directly, right? If you say, oh, should I have a tattoo? Well, it says in Leviticus not tattoo. That's a misunderstanding of what the Torah is. The Torah is meant to define who the Old Testament people are. And the purpose of the Torah is not just to give rules. It's to teach, like I said, it's to teach wisdom and what justice looks like in that ancient context. That's kind of foggy because we like clear rules because as human beings, I think a lot of us sometimes we're kind of childish. We want clear rules. What do I need to do to be right and wrong? So there's a lot more to understanding the Torah, and that's the problem with debate over morality and stuff like this is that there's so much more to understand about the context that it's often reduced to, oh, this verse says this bad, this verse says this is bad.
Well, let's grant that. Let's grant that and put that aside. Now, answer the question. Is morality derived from a transcendent standard? That was the question we're talking about. So let's grant everything you're saying about the Torah, okay? Put that aside. Where does morality come from then, in your view?
Morality is unique to human beings, and morality is an outflowing of whether or not we are in God's image. And let me just point out this because you mentioned the idolatry thing. To understand idolatry in the Old Testament is a basic theme in the Old Testament is you become like what you worship. Why does there's so much in the Torah about not worshiping other gods and worshiping idols? Is because the basic theme in the Old Testament is you become like what you worship. If you worship an idol, and idols were often in the form of beasts, and you know anything about ancient gods of Greek or ancient Near East, they were pretty horrible people. If you take them in Greek mythology class, they were not good gods. They were not moral gods. They were violent, horrible gods. The reason you sacrificed to them is because you wanted to get them off the back. You didn't love them. And in the biblical view of idolatry is you become like what you worship. If you worship these violent gods who are often in the image of animals, you become violent, animal-like, beast-like. And therefore, when you get to the Torah, the reason why Yahweh emphasized to the Israelites, don't worship those gods because you don't want to become violent and beast-like. If you want to become a true human being, you worship the God in whose image you are made. To become a true human being, you worship the true God.
So can I respond to that?
Yes.
Briefly? So if you look at the actual words and actions of that God of the Bible, Yahweh or Elohim, whatever you call him, you see that by his own actions and words, he is genocidal, pestilential, infanticidal, aborticidal, bloodthirsty, threatening, curse-hurling, slave-mongering. His own words and his own actions, he commanded the entire, killing every man, woman, and child so that his lover, the Israelites, could have a love nest called the Holy Land where they could live together and move out all those Canaanites. If the Canaanites were bad, the Israelites were just as bad, if not worse. They even had human sacrifice. You know, the story of Jephthah, where he burned his daughter as a sacrifice to God, and he was not condemned for that. There was no more. In fact, he was praised as a warrior, and he was granted a judgeship for burning his own daughter. So if you say that the purpose is to become like the God you're worshiping, then it seems to me that the purpose of the Torah is to become that same genocidal monster. And in fact, I was just at Auschwitz last week in Poland, and the Nazis wore on their belt buckles goats' meat loins. The Lutherans and the Catholics, they thought they were doing a good, godly thing by copying the genocide of the God of the Old Testament by getting rid of the vermin in the modern age. So yeah, but yes or no? Does morality come from a transcendent standard? And then that's our question. Does it, and what is it? Yes or no? That's our question tonight.
Well, yeah, and I'm trying to point out that the question itself is misguided in a little bit. It's not about morality comes from us. We are humans. We are naturally, we all have a sense of morality. To be moral is to be, and how can I say this? Oh, okay.
If you'd like to.
Okay. It's a tough question to answer, and I think it gets worse. Is because morality is part of what it means to be a mature human being. If you are, I'm drawing a blank. Threw me off.
But at least you answered the question.
Yes.
You said no.
Well, morality comes from bearing God's image and being godlike. And what you pointed out in all the Old Testament, again, you have to understand the context of a lot of these things, which goes into way more detail than we can. But you can't reduce morality to just, I kept these certain rules, therefore I'm good. That's a very childish mentality.
So give me an example of a moral act.
Well, we all know what moral acts are.
Okay, I'm sorry, guys. I'm gonna have to cut you off. We've got to move on.
Yeah.
Okay, so Dan Barker will start the second question, and that is, has the prevalence of misogyny in the Bible led to a modern misogynistic society?
Has the presence of misogyny in the Bible led to a modern misogynistic society? I wouldn't say it led to it. I would say it's contributed to it. I think there are misogynistic societies that are non-biblical. There are other societies around the world that have sexism and other isms, racism and xenophobia and that. So sexism and patriarchy and misogyny probably would exist in other cultures. But I think the Bible taps into that human propensity that we evolved to view women as less throughout history. The Bible obviously views women as less. The Bible is a very misogynistic book. If nothing else, Genesis 3:16, where God says to Eve, your desire shall be to your husband, and he shall rule over thee. Men rule over women. Look at the entire Bible. It's a book written by men for men. Even the Ten Commandments is written by men for men. And in the Ten Commandments, obviously, the 10th commandment against coveting tells men that you should not covet another man's property, including his house, his animals, his wives, and his slaves. Women were property. They were a measure of a male worth, a patriarchal society. Women were considered something that a man had. Women were valued less than men in the Bible. Even in the New Testament, 1 Timothy, if you consider this an authentic Pauline epistle, he said, "Let women learn in silence with all subjection. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." And a lot of church fathers and a lot of church teachers have perpetuated that. Some of the early Tertullian said, "Each of you women is an Eve. You are the gate of hell." Women are devalued. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, when she was working for women's rights and the right to vote in the 19th century, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, by the way, was an atheist, along with Susan B. Anthony, an agnostic woman. They were working for equality for women, and they said their biggest enemy was the church and the Bible. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said this: "The Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation." So we also see in 1 Corinthians, man is the head of the woman. We see later in 1 Corinthians, woman, keep silent, and you should learn from your husbands. Where's my book here? Hold on. I have a whole chapter in this book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, a whole chapter on misogyny. And let me just read a little bit from the introduction of that chapter, which summarizes the verses that follow. Monetarily, a woman is worth less than a man in the Old Testament. Especially obvious when the Israelites, by God's command, are buying and selling slaves. Like slaves, women are property. God allows men to have plural wives, but a woman must be married to only one man in the Bible. The census only counted the males. Women were not counted as human beings in the census. Ancestry in the Bible is only delineated from father to son. The few women in the Bible who inherit property, if there's no male heir, they are forced to marry a male relative so they can keep the property in their father's family. It's a very patriarchal, male-dominated system. Only males can be priests. Only males can approach the altar. Females have to wait outside the door. A woman is more unclean after giving birth to a daughter than to a son, the Bible says. Women, not men, must endure a cruel test for infidelity. A woman's promise can be annulled by her father or her husband, and so on. We see all through the Bible that women are treated second class. That doesn't mean that there's a direct correlation between that and modern American law, although we do see that in the 19th century, even in the 20th century, and even today, there are societies where those biblical or patriarchal religious attitudes are perpetuated in a lot of our laws. In the 19th century, women could not own property. They didn't even have control of their own children. Women could not go to college. Women could not vote. Think of that. It took Elizabeth Cady Stanton 50 years of struggle to get this basic idea that women should be able to participate in their own democracy. That comes from biblical teachings. That comes out of the teachings of these patriarchal religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I wouldn't say that the gross misogyny that's in the Bible has directly led to a misogynistic society. I think there's other ways to get there, but I think we can put a lot of blame on the Bible for how women have been treated and how women have had to fight. You know, there wasn't Judeo-Christian principles that brought us women's rights. It was protest. It was women standing up and screaming and fighting and protesting and demanding their rights. And that's the only way we have real progress, is when people do something like that. So also we see in the Bible that women were considered war booty. In Numbers 31, when God's commanding the Israelites to go in and kill and massacre, and there are places where he says, go in and kill all the men, kill all of the women that are not virgins, kill all the older women, kill all of the animals, but you can save alive the virgin girls as war booty for yourself. And so they did. These Israelites were able to go in and get the virgin girls, bring them in, and take them as wives, which I don't know what you would call that. In wartime, the brutality that happens in wartime, in fact, in Jeremiah 13, there's a passage where the Israelites, read Jeremiah 13, it's fascinating. The Israelites were asking God, how come this bad stuff's happening to us? How come these outside nations are invading us? Why, God? Why is this happening? And God said, because I'm a jealous God and you have been unfaithful to me. So I'm letting these nations come in to attack you, to destroy you, and to rape your women. He says, your skirts are lifted up and you are violated. What happens during war? We know what happens during war. Women are raped by the invaders. And then a few verses later, God himself said, I myself am lifting up your skirts. God himself is taking credit, bragging about sexual assault. There's a whole bunch of that in the Bible. So I think there's a lot of blame for modern misogyny that stems to a large degree from the sexist teachings that are in the Bible.
Okay, let's just jump right into it. Hopefully I can be more coherent with this one.
I'll repeat the question real
Okay,
quick.
go ahead.
Has the prevalence of misogyny in the Bible led to a modern misogynistic society?
All right. First off, we're in agreement. We both are going to say that it didn't lead to modern misogynistic society. When you look at the Bible and stuff, you have to realize we're dealing with the ancient world. The ancient world was highly patriarchal. I was there. Keep going. That's what I did not get to. I was going to meet you in Kierkegaard and impress you. No, not Kierkegaard. No. Oh, here we go. Seriously, I love talking about Nietzsche. I'm going to bring it in sometime. All right. When we talk about the Bible, biblical times were patriarchal. The ancient Near East was a patriarchal society, and there was an abuse of women. That's the ancient society in which the Israelites found themselves. They were ancient Israelites, ancient Near Eastern people. When you look at the Bible, though, you have to read it through that lens. So let's just start off at the very beginning. Misogyny's been everywhere. As long as you have men in power, you're going to get that occasionally. At the same time, let me point out that you do have to realize modern Western society has, when you compare it to other societies throughout history, our society today has a lot better than most societies in history. Women have a lot more opportunity. So even though there will always be misogyny, at some point, somewhere, everywhere, I think where we are in Western society today is pretty good. Okay, now let's get to the biblical stuff. All right, so let's start with the very beginning to understand a little bit about this. When you get to the first 3 chapters of Genesis, one of the very first things you're told in the creation account is that when God makes human beings, he makes them male, female, they are in his image. Right there, the very first statements about human beings that God makes is that male and female together, image of God. It implies equality right there, value and worth. The second thing in Genesis 2, we all know the story of Eve being created out of Adam's, some translations say rib. The actual Hebrew word is side, to be his helpmate. Don't interpret that as like some being subservient secretary. The idea is to be equal with male and female, to be equal together, to be full humanity. The very first, so therefore in Genesis 1 and 2, it's mentioned, the very first mentioning of men and women, the impression that's trying to be getting across is of equality of value all across the board. Now, Genesis 3:16, which Dan quoted, you have to realize what happens in Genesis 3. That's when they eat the fruit and they sin and they disobey. The consequence, and this is the point of Genesis 3, the consequence of sin in the world is there's going to be a battle of the sexes, and it's not a good thing. This is a consequence of sin, is that men are going to rule over women, not like, I guess sometimes like cavemen, but women are going to be subjected to men as a result of sin. It's not a good thing. And so, yes, that verse is there, but it's not, God isn't saying, hey, this is part of what I want. If you want to understand misogyny, it is a result of sinful people, and it's not what God wants. Okay, so that's the first thing with Genesis 1 through 3. Now, when you go through the rest of the Old Testament, let's talk about the Torah. Again, remember, the Torah, again, is in the ancient Near East. And when you look at the Torah, even though from our perspective, some of the laws and stuff sound odd, from that time period, from that point of view, it was actually, believe it or not, better than other cultures in the ancient Near East. Even, I mentioned the bride price here, one of the things that's mentioned, they just sell women for wives and stuff. You have to realize in the ancient world, part of the reason they had a bride price is because when a family, when a daughter would be married off, that family, they didn't live like we do today. They lived off land, they had their own family farm, everybody worked. And so a family would be losing a worker for their family farm. And so therefore, if a man married a daughter, there was a way maintain societal order, the bride price was there to compensate for the loss of a worker so they can move on there. So it wasn't like they were treating the women like cattle. It was a thing within the ancient world that was we can't relate to right now. Now, also one thing we have to look out at in the Old Testament. 2 minutes already? Crikey. I'm not in Australia. In the Old Testament, throughout the stories, there are so many women mentioned in the Old Testament that are heroines, right? I won't name them all, but in the ancient world, that's actually kind of unique. Let's go through the New Testament. I'll get through the New Testament stuff. You had Jesus' treatment of women. We don't realize that he had women followers, women disciples, which in that time period is astounding. He clearly showed love and caring and equality of women. Paul, people love to say Paul was a misogynist, but if you go through all of these verses, you have to, again, see them in context. In the Ephesians and Colossians one, where it says wives submit to their husbands. In the ancient world, wives in the Greco-Roman world submitted to their husbands. What Paul says that is unique that we forget is that he says, okay, fine, wives submit to your husband. But what comes after that? Husbands, love your wives as your own self. In the Greco-Roman world, that was weird. Husbands married their wives just for other reasons, and they would go tempt prostitutes for fun. The idea for a husband to be faithful to their wives was a Christian unique thing that was revolutionary in the ancient world. Go to the next one really quick. I can't go through all of them. Consider these two quotes by two biographers of Paul. Thomas Cahill says, where is it? Paul made the only clarion affirmation of sexual equality in the whole of the Bible. It was the first one ever to made in any of the many literatures or planet. And A. Wilson, in his biography, said, Paul, at that time in the ancient world, you would have been hard put to find anyone who believed in sexual equality in the modern sense, and the person who comes closest to it is Paul. When you read Paul in light of the Greco-Roman culture, not ours, but from that time period, he was light years ahead of his time. And what I wanted to do next week, I will put this next slide, not now. I'm going to compare how women were treated in the Greco-Roman world with how the early church treated them. Very differently. You have to keep in mind. All right.
All right. We've got a 5-minute rebuttal period.
Oh, that's right. You go first.
I rebut first? Oh, you get to rebut me?
Why don't I just point out my last 2 points?
5 minutes each, is that what you're saying? Or?
Yeah, 5 minutes total.
Oh, total. Oh, I get it. Okay. So it seems that we kind of agree on the basic question.
Misogyny, it doesn't come, the root cause is not the Bible. Misogyny is everywhere in all societies.
Yeah, and so I would guess that a loving, all-caring, all-knowing God who's given his word to humankind, if we assume that the Bible is written to you and me too, not just to the ancient Israelites, I would assume he'd be above that he would rise above and say something about, not just misogyny, but about slavery. Like, slavery's wrong, by the way, and you shouldn't sell your daughters into slavery. But in that culture, they were, and the Israelites and God himself even gave rules about how you can sell your daughters into slavery and what prices you can get from that. So I think you would agree with me that the Bible has contributed to that, because coming from a European culture that came over here with Judeo-Christian principles, they brought some of those ideas with them, that women were to keep silent. And you do know that the New Testament says that Adam didn't sin first, Eve did. Eve was blamed for the fall of the human race. Always blamed the woman, right? She was blamed for it because she did. You said it was because of sin that there was this inequality, right? So what was the sin? She wanted knowledge. She wanted to defy the authority, and she wanted a knowledge of good and evil, relating to our previous question. So what's so bad about a woman wanting to defy authority to gain knowledge? I mean, she should be rewarded for that. And if it was a sin, why was the inequality that resulted that women submitted to husbands? Why wasn't it the other way around? Why didn't God say, okay, husbands submit to your wives? Why did it happen to be that way? Or were the writers of the Bible stuck in the patriarchy of the day, and the Bible is no better than the culture in which it sprung from?
Well, yeah, you have to understand the Genesis 3 is not, it's trying to explain just the state of humanity. When you look at humanity, and it's trying to balance these two things, Humanity is made in God's image, but at the same time, we're sinful. You can't read Genesis 3 as if it was a blow-by-blow literal account of two literal people. It's trying to explain the state of humanity. We're made in the image of God, but at the same time, we're sinful. And we see that evidence of sin in the world is women are often submitted to husbands, and husbands, not just husbands, but men basically rule over women throughout most of history. That's a bad thing. But let me just point one thing out. You can show it if you want. If you really want to see the difference between the New Testament, yes. If you want to understand, let's put it in perspective. In the Greco-Roman world in which Jesus and Paul lived, this is what life was like for women. Girls were married off to much older men. Over 50% of pagan women married off by 15. 20% were married off by 12. 4% by 10. And because they married older men, they would die. The older men would die, and they'd be married off time and time again. So by the time you were an older woman, you would have been married off like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. You had no choice. In the Greco-Roman world, women could be divorced for any reason. In addition, a father and a brother could force a divorce of a happily married woman. She had no say in it. In addition, husbands could decide to kill an unwanted infant or force their wives to have an abortion. And a lot of times, because men did not want daughters, they would expose their daughters. You know what that is? Basically, if she gave birth and it was a daughter he didn't want, they would literally throw the young girls out in the trash. It was the early Christians who would go through the trash, find these unwanted children, raise them as themselves. In contrast, and plus, there's the whole temple prostitution thing. I'm pretty sure girls did not want that. If you compare that to the early church treatment of women, there were women in leadership. Paul mentions a number of them in his letters. The early church's marriage rates, most girls were not married until they were 18. They had their consent. The point is that when it comes to, if you want to look at biblical stuff, especially in the New Testament, the way women were treated in both Jesus' time and early church of Paul was considerably better than the Greco-Roman world. And that's why it was known as a religion of women and slaves, because women and slaves were given the dignity and equality that the Greco-Roman world did not afford.
So why did Paul tell women to keep silent and just learn from their husbands? They could not participate in church. Were they more stupid? Were they not as knowledgeable? Why did Paul say that?
Well, first of all, the verses in 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35, there is a textual argument, not to freak anybody out here. There's a very good textual argument that those two verses, 34 and 35, are not part of Paul's original letter. That's the first thing. When you get to, what is it? Is it 1 Timothy? 1 Timothy? Yeah. I can't remember. 1st and 2nd Timothy, I see this up. N.T. Wright, biblical scholar N.T. Wright, he expounds on that more. But you're overlooking one thing. Paul's saying women should learn. In the Greco-Roman world, women shouldn't learn. And on top of that, because he was writing to Timothy in Ephesus, there was the cult of Artemis in Ephesus, where in that cult, women were seen as being domineering over men. So what Paul is saying in that passage, he's saying, women should learn at home. That's a good thing. Not to say that women should be dominant in the home, because he's working for equality. So basically, those verses you have to understand in the context, and unfortunately, people don't do that. That's
Can I ask for one clarification?
Yeah, sure.
Am I right that you agree with me that the story of Adam and Eve was allegorical, that it was not actually a historical story, it was more of a metaphor?
Yeah, I think the early chapters in Genesis are not meant to be taken literally. Okay. And I think we could talk about that if you want, but I think
let's move on.
All right. Question number 3, Dr. Anderson will go first. And the question is, how can we have free will if God is sovereign and knows all?
Okay, from here on out, everything's on one sheet. So let's go quicker. All right. Yes. All right. First off, if you're going to ask the question, that's going to assume that there's a God. So obviously, we're going to be assuming that as we discuss this. All right. This is hard to see from my perspective. All right. First point. Now, oh yeah, look at that. And you're probably wondering why Mike did go there. I'll explain that if I get to that. Apostle Paul was not a Calvinist. And a lot of the discussions, I grew up in the church, going to Christian school, free will, predestination debates kind of go on forever. Paul was not a Calvinist. He was not denying free will. But one of the problems with discussing this question, a lot of times we have this assumption, we view God as kind of like a puppet master. He's sovereign. He really knows what you're going to do. I think, again, this is a wrong way of going about it. C.S. Lewis mentions a couple of examples in his book, Mere Christianity, to try to understand how do you balance free will and the idea of God being sovereign. He gives one example of, let's say you're in a house, window over here, and you see the edge of the roof here and the edge of the roof there. But where you're situated, you can't see where they actually intersect. But at some point they do. Okay? From a human perspective, from a Christian perspective, we know we make choices. We do. But also we have the belief that God is sovereign. So how that comes together, ultimately, can we figure that out completely on our own? No, we believe that it somehow comes together. Another example he gives is scissor blades. Debating whether it's free will or God's sovereignty and predestination. It's kind of like debating which part of the scissors is more important. They both work together. A third example I came up with on my own is my grandparents. I think they ended up with a 60th anniversary, but let's say you go to your grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary and you ask them, were you just meant to be, did God plan you two to be together? Guess what they're going to say? They're going to say yes. And then you're going to say, Grandpa, did you propose to Grandma? Did you make the choice to do that? Guess what he's going to say? Yes. And throughout your marriage, did you guys make choices to work on your relationship? Yes. Both things they would say are true. And so when we talk about this from a Christian perspective, you have to keep them in tension with each other. Now, biblically, how is this reconciled? It comes down to, not surprisingly, a misunderstanding of a couple of passages in Romans. Let's get to chapter 9. The famous chapter 9 is where it talks about God predestined, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. And a lot of people take that to mean that God chooses who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. You really don't have a choice. It's God who chooses you. But what Paul is arguing in his letter to Romans, in chapter 9 in particular, he is trying to understand how his fellow Jews missed out on recognizing the Messiah, because obviously he accepts Jesus the Messiah. And what he concludes is that God's plan all along was to bring about the inclusion of the Gentiles to be his people. Okay? And he chose Israel in the Old Testament to be the nation through whom he works, but that wasn't the end game. And so Paul's trying to understand, how did the Jews miss out on the Messiah? And what Paul concludes is that just being ethnically Jewish doesn't mean you're automatically part of God's people. And he uses the example of Jacob and Esau. They were both children of Abraham. No, I got it. That's Isaac. No, I totally screwed up. I said they were children of Abraham, and that's totally wrong. Abraham's children were, I'm drawing a blank.
Isaac and Ishmael.
Yes, thank you very much, former pastor. Isaac and Ishmael. But one was child of the promise, one wasn't. And then you had Jacob and Esau. They were in the same womb, but one was a child of the promise, one wasn't. And Paul was saying that God's choice, God's sovereignty to bring about the Messiah, that's his end game. And it isn't dependent on human personal choice. Humans make choices, but their choices do not affect God's ultimate purposes. God incorporates human choices into his purposes. One more example. He uses the example of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a bad dude, if you know the Exodus story. In a sense, God used Pharaoh's badness to bring about the liberation of the children of Israel. If Pharaoh wasn't a bad dude, if Moses said, let my people go, and Pharaoh right away said, okay, who's going to get credit for bringing Israel out from bondage? Pharaoh. But God wants to show that he has power over the Egyptian gods and Pharaoh. So Pharaoh says no, he's a bad guy, and God says, okay, I'm going to use that. Keep saying no, and I'm going to keep showing my power to the Egyptians. So by the time the Israelites are leaving the Exodus, all the Egyptians know that it's the power of the Israelite God that has brought them out, not Pharaoh. And so the point in Romans 9 is God, human beings have free will and choice, but God is sovereign enough to use those choices to eventually bring about his ultimate purposes. Now, the final thing I want to say is, oh, I should tell you why I have my dick up there. You ever seen Kicking and Screaming? The movie Kicking and Screaming? Here's my great analogy that I came up just from my high school kids when I taught high school. There's a scene where Will Ferrell doesn't know what to do with the soccer team, so he gets Mike Ditka to help him coach. Super Bowl winning coach. And when they introduce him to the team, Mike Ditka goes into this coach rant. You know, you're gonna hate me. You're this is gonna be horrible. Blah 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 blah. But when you're done, you're gonna be champions because I'm Super Bowl winning coach. If you choose to be on this team, I'm gonna put you through hell, but you're gonna be champions. That's basically what he's saying. When I think of how you balance free will and God's sovereignty, it's kind of like Mike Ditka. If you choose to follow Christ, that's what Paul is saying, you're going to go through some really difficult times. But in the end, God's sovereign plan to bring about salvation and a renewal of creation is going to be fulfilled. You can choose to be part of that, but it's not he's choosing who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. I hope that makes sense.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
One thing you just said. You said that Pharaoh was a bad dude.
Yes.
And therefore Moses gets the credit for taking the people out of Egypt. It reminds me that in Romans 11:32, that St. Paul says that God delivers to all in disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
So he can show his mercy. So he's doing the same thing. God is being evil to show his mercy.
But God is being evil?
Well, he delivered all of us through disobedience.
Well, I think Paul is basically saying, it's another way Paul is basically saying, we're all sinful, we all choose to disobey. That's a given. Okay.
Well, that's part of that verse. I mean,
Right.
it said God delivered it. He did it, showed that he could show his mercy.
Yeah, well,
All right. Now, Dan, you'll have 7 minutes. I'll repeat the question. How can we have free will if God is sovereign and knows all?
So this is a hypothetical question. It'd be like asking, was the big bad wolf a good character or a bad one? If you answer it, you're not agreeing that the big bad wolf actually existed. You're talking hypothetically. I wrote a whole book about free will. It's called Free Will Explained. That was the publisher's title. I wanted to call it Make Up Your Mind, but they wanted free will in the title. And I point out that you don't have to be an expert to realize that all the experts disagree about free will. Scientists disagree with each other. Philosophers disagree with each other. Theologians disagree with each other. And we heard reference to that tonight. Martin Luther wrote a book called The Bondage of the Will. No, we have no free will. But others, Aquinas, disagreed. So Christians disagree with each other about free will. Everybody thinks they're an expert on free will, but nobody really comes to an agreement. Christopher Hitchens said, yes, I have free will. I have no choice but to have free will. Which is a funny quip. It doesn't really say much. And so what do we mean by free will? When we use the word free will, what are we actually saying? What do you mean? What do you want to be free from? Can you be free if you have no options? What do we actually mean by free will? Most philosophers, who, by the way, most philosophers would be compatibilists in the free will debate. Most philosophers define free will as the ability to do otherwise. You made a choice, you picked chocolate, but you really could have chosen strawberry. It wasn't predetermined. Most hard determinists say, nope, you could not have done otherwise. You can't rise above the laws of nature and cause and effect and change what the laws of nature, all of our neurons are firing. We didn't choose how our brain works. We didn't choose to even be born. We are the result of previous causes and effect, and therefore everything we do is predetermined. Hard determinists will say that, like Sam Harris. I agree with Sam Harris, except Sam Harris says free will is an illusion. Sam Harris said free will is a pernicious, bad illusion that we should discard. I agree, free will is an illusion. We don't have what you would call libertarian free will, the free will that rises above nature to change the laws of nature like we're some little gods ourselves. We are stuck. But I think free will is a very useful illusion. I think the illusion of free will is what allows us to justify moral judgments. If we didn't assume that the actor had free will to do otherwise, we wouldn't condemn them. We would just say, oh, well, imagine a criminal saying to the judge, hey, judge, the universe made me do it, so don't blame me. Obviously, there's a locus of action of an individual that we assign moral judgment to a person, assuming they could have done otherwise when they didn't. But I think a more important question, talking about God, if he existed, most definitions of God and most Christian definitions of God say that he knows the future. God is all-knowing, and he knows everything about the past, the present, and the future. In fact, many Christians offer one of the evidences for God is prophecy. The prophecies were made and then they came true. This God knows the future. And the question of human free will, I don't think is that important in the discussion, but just imagine if God knows the future. In order to have free will, whether you think you have it or not, in order to have free will, you have to have a moment of uncertainty. Chocolate or strawberry. You have to exist in a moment before your final decision. I'm going to choose chocolate, you say. But you could change your mind in the last second, couldn't you? And you could choose strawberry, right? So in order to have free will, you have to be able to envision future alternatives, two or more, or some philosophers call it latitude. You have to have, the more latitude you have, the more free will you have, they say. And then after you make your choice, retroactively, you'll look back and say, oh yeah, well, it was all predetermined. But before you make that choice, you have to exist in a period of an uncertain future. You have to not know what the future is. If God exists, and if God is a personal being, and if God knows the future, then he can never exist in that period of uncertainty in which he would make a choice, because the future to him is already fixed. And most Christian theologians agree that God can predict the future. In fact, there's the New Testament writers, especially Matthew, put a big stock in prophecy, and this prophecy was fulfilled. So if you know the future, you cannot have free will, because to you the future is fixed and it's unchangeable. So if God knows what he's going to do tomorrow at 12 noon, he's going to make it rain tomorrow at 12:01. He knows that today. So when tomorrow at 12:01 comes, he can't change his mind because he already knew it. If he does show us how powerful he is, and he changes his mind anyway, well, then he wasn't omniscient in the first place. Something's got to give. There's these incompatible properties in the definitions of God. So I call it the free will argument for the non-existence of God, F-A-N-G, the Fang argument, which you can read about in, I forget which book it's in. So Pharaoh was indeed a bad dude, but you neglected part of the story. Pharaoh said no 6 times. Then he started saying yes. Pharaoh said, yes, okay, let him go. And God said, no, I'm going to harden your heart. You can't blame Pharaoh for those last 4. The last 4, Pharaoh said, let him go. And God said, no. And you know what God's reasoning was? Read the Bible. Why did God not allow Pharaoh to let the people go? He got what he wanted, right? The Israelites are free. Pharaoh said, you can go, you can go. But more plagues had to follow. And you know what God said? He says, because I'm not through showing you my signs. I'm not through showing you how powerful I am. It's kind of like a cat with a mouse. Wait, I'm not going to kill you yet. Wait, I want to show you what I'm going to bring locusts, and I'm going to kill your children. I want to show you how horrible I can be as a God. Then you will be afraid of me. Then you'll know that I'm the one who set the Israelites free. So by God's own actions and by God's own words in the Bible, read it, God himself claims that he and his actions are evil actions. There are dozens and dozens of verses where God says, I'm bringing this evil upon you to teach you a lesson. I am causing this evil upon you. The word wickedness is never connected with God. Evil himself. God himself uses the word evil a lot. So it's a fairy tale. I mean, the story of the plagues of Egypt didn't happen. But assuming that they did, don't put all the blame on Pharaoh. God himself was causing that huge mess to happen. The Nile River turning to blood, and the darkness, and all the cattle being killed, and then after the cattle were all killed, there was a hailstorm which killed all the cattle. He forgot that they were already dead. Anyway, so read the whole thing in context. Read the whole thing and see the picture. That really is about God showing what a big evil monster he is, so that people will fear him.
All right, you guys have a 5-minute rebuttal period.
So you think free will is ultimately an illusion?
Yeah.
Okay.
A good illusion, a useful illusion.
Okay, and you're saying that the free will is an illusion, and that is the basis to make moral judgments. What would you say?
It's not the basis for moral judgments. It justifies, it gives us a justification for making moral judgments in the real world. For example, suppose you're on a jury, and this guy did this horrible thing, and you're all sure of it, and he's convicted of this horrible crime. But during sentencing, you learn that that criminal had a brain tumor. How does that affect your moral judgment of that person? Well, wait a minute. Well, that person's more of a victim than a criminal. You realize that there are antecedent causes behind that person's action, but we still have to lock them up, either in prison or in a mental hospital. So in the act of making a moral judgment, we have to assume that the agent was free, even though they're not. It's an illusion we have. It's very useful to making our moral judgments.
So morality is essentially an illusion.
Yeah, a useful illusion. Because we're social animals that have to get along in a social environment. In the ultimate picture, there's no such thing as morality. In the ultimate cosmic picture, there's no such thing as meaning. But in the immediate picture right now, morality and meaning are immensely important to us to get through our lives.
So let's go for Godwin's law here. So basically, technically, according to you, Hitler throwing 6 million Jews in ovens really wasn't morally wrong. We just say it's morally wrong because wrong.
Because he caused harm. He caused unnecessary harm. And we judge that. Those of us who have moral judgment, who are not psychopaths, we can exercise our moral judgment and say he didn't have to do that, although in determinism he did. We can still exercise our judgment and say that was wrong. He didn't have to do it. We assume that he didn't, but he did anyway, so he is morally culpable by our choice. In the cosmic picture, it doesn't matter. Anything you and I do in the cosmic picture doesn't matter, because morality is not relative to the universe. It's relative to you and me as social human beings interacting with each other. Morality is something that exists between you and me. It's not a thing.
Okay. So he's immoral for killing 6 million Jews because we just can say that is immoral because we don't think he should do that.
Because it's harm. There's the principle.
Why should he give a crap when it's harm? If he's trying to propagate the species of the Germanic people, then that would be a good thing in his eyes.
Actually, it was a good thing in his eyes. And it was
So from his perspective, it was morally good.
In fact, most of the Nazi criminals owned their actions. They thought that the extermination of the Jews was a good, godly, moral thing to do. And they didn't back off like in other war crimes. The Japanese and the Soviets, they would say, I had no choice, I was following orders. But most of the Nazis, who were, and it wasn't just Hitler, you know, it was the German Lutherans and the German Catholics. Most of them thought they were doing the right thing. And Hitler went to his grave thinking he was doing the right thing because the Jews were the enemy vermin that were threatening the national identity of the Germans. But you and I are judging Hitler. Hitler might have been a psychopath. He might not have owned what he did. But you and I have moral brains, and you and I are free to judge him based on the principle of the amount of harm that he caused. And that's a natural thing. Therefore, the harm itself is what we are using to say that was bad, that was wrong. In the cosmic picture, it's not going to matter. We're all going to be gone, and there won't be any social species left. But in the immediate picture of families being torn from their parents and being killed and sent to gas chambers, that is grotesque. That is morally reprehensible.
Why?
Because it's harmful. Why are you asking why? By nature, we naturally recoil from harm. Harm threatens us. Harm is what threatens our existence and our well-being. We don't like it. You put your hand in the fire, you naturally recoil. You don't need a moral principle for that. Harm is something we want to avoid by definition. You don't have to ask why.
Right. Well, but my point is, if you're going to say free will is an illusion and morality is an illusion, and then write books about why this is wrong and immoral, and you are judging that to be wrong and immoral, at the same time you remain it really isn't wrong or moral, I just say it is. I find that astoundingly illogical. What Hitler did was wrong. It is morally wrong. It's not just, I don't know, whatever.
I agree, it was morally wrong.
But you're basing it, you admit it, is based on an illusion. Morality and immorality really aren't real.
See, you just took your glasses off.
Yeah.
I have monovision, and so when I'm looking at you now, I don't have depth perception. I see two of you right now. When I put my glasses on, I gain depth perception. Depth perception is an illusion in the brain. Depth perception doesn't actually exist in reality. It's an illusion that's very useful for navigating the natural world. And we all admit, I mean, you're seeing two of me right now, but your brain is making an illusion that you're only seeing one of me, right? Your brain is doing this trick. So moral judgment is the same thing. There is really no actual cosmic morality, but the social animals that we are have this illusion to navigate moral terrain, and we call that free will, and we call that moral judgment. It's very important to us, it's very useful to us, and Hitler was morally wrong, absolutely morally wrong, in this context of our species, our human species. He was wrong.
But morality is an illusion.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Question 4, Dan Barker will go first. And the question is, are humans just physical beings, or do they have an immaterial self that lives on after death?
So we are just biological organisms in a natural environment. We do not live on after death in any meaningful, individualistic, conscious way. But the question kind of has a built-in assumption that being a physical being, it says, are we just physical object? As if there was something bad about being just an animal. Wow, we're just only these lowly things. Most religious terminology flips it around. Most religions think that the natural world is debased and low, and that there's a higher realm that we can all reach up to, which is better than just being natural animals, because animals have instincts, and we use the word sin if you want to. So there is no evidence that any human consciousness survives death. There's stories, but there's no real testable evidence that that happens. And we hear about, do we have spirits and do we have souls that live on beyond death? I think the word soul is just a synonym for the word personality. Consciousness, all of us to some degree are conscious, depending on how much coffee I've had today, affecting my brain states. It's a mistake to think that consciousness is a thing that somehow exists like above and beyond. Consciousness is just a word for a process or for a function. So when the brain is functioning, and at least in the higher primates in our brains, which are complicated enough not just to observe and to be aware, but to also to observe ourselves being aware, there's this feedback loop that happens. Douglas Hofstadter's book is called I Am a Strange Loop. And in Daniel Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, he talks about how consciousness is not really a thing. He calls it the center of narrative gravity. But and there's other analogies. Anthony Damasio, in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, talks about how isn't this illusion of myself and my consciousness, what is that? And so we all have this feeling that we are these egos, these eyes that somehow exist separate from our bodies. Again, that's an illusion. That's what some people would call an emergent property. As soon as the brain goes, or as soon as the computer's turned off, that intelligence is gone. Where does it go? Is consciousness still hovering somewhere up in the air? A good analogy, this is not perfect, but a good analogy would be to use another organ besides the brain. Use the organ of the stomach. What does the stomach do? Digestion. The stomach does digestion. Does that mean that there's a thing in the cosmos called capital D, digestion? And what happens when the stomach dies? Where does the digestion go? Does it just disappear, or does it follow your stomach along? When you walk across the room, does the digestion follow your stomach? Digestion is just a word, a label for a function of an organ. It's a label for the process. The heart is a physical organ, but the heart has circulation. Is circulation a thing, or is circulation just a label for a process? Likewise, the brain is an organ of the body, and when the brain is functioning like a heart or a stomach, it is doing things that we call thoughts and consciousness. But as soon as that brain dies, it's not like those functions are things that exist somewhere in the cosmos. Although that illusion is very powerful, isn't it? We all think we are something above and beyond our bodies. As I walk across the stage, does my spirit somehow tether to this skull? Why doesn't it jump into Joel's skull? Why doesn't it jump into your skull? What is it? It's obviously a reification of a concept. So atheists don't believe in life after death. We believe in life before death. And I do think we do live on, if I put that word in quotes, we do live on in the memories of others. We do live on in the lingering effects of the deeds that we have done. If you're an architect, if you're a songwriter, or whatever you do in life after you die, if you're an author, you live on in the minds of others. I can still read Bertrand Russell and Charles Darwin. I can still read, Plato. And they live on in my mind, although they are not living on anywhere. So we are not just physical entities. We are proudly biological organisms in a natural environment. And by the way, this desire for eternal life is understandable. Really, none of us want to die, right? We want to think we're living on, and we dream about grandma, and we think grandma must be living somewhere else because we're dreaming about her. But I think if life is eternal, then life is cheap. Don't we give more value to things that are rare and precious, like precious metals? When things are limited, their value goes up. So if things are plentiful, their value goes down. We don't have as much value to it. So if there is eternal life, then life is really a cheap commodity. The fact that it ends is what makes it more precious. I think most of us atheists would say, I'm going to die someday, and that's it, and we're not even going to know it. There was an eternity of time before you existed. When you didn't exist, and it didn't bother you one bit, did it? And the same will be true after you're dead. It's not going to bother you. So actually, I think the brevity of life, the fact that we are not eternal souls and spirits who are not going to live on in some cheap afterlife where all we do is, praise this father figure. What's the point of that? Maybe he's got a point. Maybe he has this big ego who needs to be praised. What if I was to demand that? What if I was to say, you all need to praise me forever? You would think I was nuts. You would think I was a megalomaniacal person. So those of us who don't believe in a personal transcendence of life after death, actually, I think, value this life even more. It's brief, it's precious, let's not waste it on the altar of some eternal hope.
Okay. Well, again, to understand this question, you need to kind of get a lay of the land. When it comes to other religions, Eastern religions, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, essentially, they view the material world as illusionary, that ultimately even individuality is an illusion. And therefore, when you die, you just are a drop that goes back into the cosmic ocean. There's nothing beyond that. When you go to the ancient Greeks, they were the ones who had this idea that essentially you are a spirit trapped in a material body. One of my favorite songs when I was a kid was about the police, not the cops, that's the group, police. We are spirits in a material world. It's a great song. That's kind of the Greek view. That's not the biblical view. The biblical view, in a nutshell, is not that you have a spirit or soul in your body, but that you are a soul, what we would call body and spirit together. They don't. The biblical view of human beings is not your spirit's trapped in a body. And unfortunately, if you grew up in church like I did, you kind of had this idea that when I die, I'm going to be cast with the friendly ghosts on a spirit cloud playing a harp. That's not the biblical view. Unfortunately, that's the way a lot of people think it is. The biblical view is rooted in the very beginning of Genesis, when it says that God created the material world, that it was good. Okay, and despite sin and corruption, throughout the Old Testament, there was a promise that at some point, somehow, he was going to redeem all of creation, bring about a transformed creation. Not a spirit world, but a transformation of the material world that is not susceptible to corruption. When you get to the New Testament, and this gets to the heart of the New Testament Christian claim regarding the resurrection. First of all, the Jews did not expect their Jewish Messiah to come and die. They expected the Jewish Messiah to come, that God would miraculously renew creation and everything would be awesome, okay? But then Jesus died. And then nobody thought that. But then, surprisingly, a few days later, the disciples start claiming that he was resurrected. Now, this idea of resurrection is something that a lot of people can't get their minds around. You know, that's the big issue. In first century Second Temple Judaism, the term resurrection in Jewish belief meant bodily resurrection. If they were talking about Jesus' spirit going up to heaven afterward, they would not have used the term resurrection. Okay? So, when we read in the Gospels that the disciples claim Jesus was resurrected, even if you don't believe he was, that's what they claimed. Okay? And you cannot interpret that to mean that he was he just floated up to heaven. That's not what resurrection means. Now, what does that mean? What's the importance of that claim? The Christian claim of the resurrection reaffirms the goodness of the material world, that God is going to redeem the material world, and that the Christian claim is that just as Jesus rose again, resurrected to a transformed, basically immortal physical body, the Christian hope is that Christians too will one day resurrect physically, not spirits in heaven like the Greeks thought, but that God would renew the creation, that the Christians who put their faith in Christ would resurrect physically somehow. Obviously, we don't get that because we're not there yet. But the idea is that the resurrection marked the renewal of all creation. That creation is good, the material creation is good, it's not something that's going to be thrown away, and that human beings are going to be redeemed in that physical sense. Now that's a hard thing to get your mind around. So you don't think that in the first century, that when they started claiming that people were going, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That sounds stupid to Greeks. Why would you want to come back in this body? They thought you wanted to shed this mortal form. But the Christian hope, therefore, about life after death isn't so much life after death, it's life through death. That's the claim that they made with Jesus, that he went down into death and that he conquered it, that he rose again, never to die again. And that is the Christian hope. Not that we're going to go off and be spirits on a cloud, but that the fallen creation will be transformed, redeemed, that human beings will be this stuff. It sounds weird. This stuff, we're going to die someday. It's going to somehow resurrect into immortality and be like Jesus was on Easter Sunday. That's the claim. Now again, if you don't believe that human beings are anything more than biological creatures, that's going to sound stupid. But from the Christian perspective is that human beings are both biological creatures. We share biology with all the rest of nature. But at the same time, we are more than just biological creatures. And the spirit world is not just something out there. It is the thing that empowers the very creation itself. And so that we have to get, and this is the problem that we have in our modern world. We're so influenced by this dualistic idea that the Greeks had that we tend to read into that what's in the Bible, and that's unfortunate. But that's the idea. The Christian hope is that life after death is not some disembodied existence. It's that this existence that we have, it's going to decay, is somehow going to be redeemed and transformed. And so that's it in a nutshell.
All right, you have 5 minutes for a rebuttal period.
So I think I'm hearing you say that, as you said earlier, the Adam and Eve story are more of a parable or a metaphor, not an actual historical story. Mm-hmm. But I think you're also agreeing that the ancient Israelites did not have a concept of life after death. In fact, in Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve are cursed, Adam is cursed, and what is the end result? There's no talk about life after death or heaven or hell. It's just dust to dust. You came from the dust, you're going to go back to the dust. It was a physical thing. And it wasn't until the New Testament that this idea that there was a...
Well, there's a number of places in the Old Testament, a number of Psalms, in the book of Job, a number of the prophets. There is, in the New Testament, this pondering, in the Old Testament, this pondering, this thought of, because this creation is good, even though we die, that somehow we believe that God will somehow bring us through that. You get that, like I said, in a number of Psalms and Job. So it's there in the Old Testament as kind of a vague hope and pondering, but it's in the New Testament that the disciples who were Jews, obviously, came out and said, this guy came back to life and this is what it means.
So you're saying that the Christian afterlife is a physical, material afterlife?
Yeah, the Christian hope is a renewed creation. It is, this physical creation will be transformed, redeemed, not we're going to be cast with a friendly ghost in heaven. That is a very Greek-influenced concept that when you read the Bible, that's not what's
So what would be made of atoms and cells and molecules and affected by gravity and all of that?
Well, that's what the resurrection stories, you have, Jesus was clearly physical there. They touched him, he ate, and they were trying to explain what they experienced, but they emphasized that he was bodily raised, that there was something different about it. And they didn't fully understand it because you're not expecting it. But what the purpose of the resurrection stories is to emphasize that, yeah, this physical created world, your bodies that are going to die and go into dust, somehow, through the power of God, will resurrect and be transformed into not spirit Casper ghosts. I really like Casper today. I don't know why I'm saying Casper. But as physical beings who are empowered by God's Spirit, who will not die again.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the gospel writers used the word resurrection. I think Paul was the one who used anastasis, anistemi, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 said, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. He was talking about a spiritual resurrection. And in fact, in his...
No such thing as a spiritual resurrection. Resurrection, by definition, is bodily resurrection, empowered by the Spirit.
But he said in that same chapter, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God.
Meaning this corrupt world, the way we have it now, cannot. It requires transformation and resurrection. When Paul talks about the difference between flesh and spirit, he's talking about, I'll give it an analogy. Think of like an Energizer bunny, okay? This world, in our fallen world, is the battery in the bunny is going to run down and die. Okay, you are going to die. Okay, what Paul and the gospel writers and Paul said is what they saw happen in Jesus is even though you're going to die, that God's Spirit is kind of like an eternal. Think of the Holy Spirit is kind of an eternal battery. In my analogy, when that battery goes into the bunny, it's still physical bunny, but it's not going to run down and die. So when Paul talks about a spiritual body, he's not talking about airy body, he's talking about the physical body empowered by God's Spirit.
So you use the word in your statement, you use the word soul and spirit, suggesting that we are more than just biological animals. There's something else above and beyond this. So can you give us a positive definition of that word spirit? How big is it? How much does it weigh? How much space does it take? What is a spirit? Tell us what that word means.
Well, again, you're trying to make a distinction between body and spirit. The whole biblical perception of human beings is that we are biological creatures, but there's something more to us that you can't weigh it. If you weigh it, it's a physical thing. So you can't do what you ask.
So what is it?
It is part of who you are.
But
it is
what,
part of
but,
you that connects with
but what is it?
It is part of your being.
The Bible says God is a spirit, and they who worship must worship in spirit and truth, the Holy Spirit. So that word spirit has to have a meaning. You can't just say God is a flisterdoodle. I mean, the word spirit has to mean something. And in order for anything to exist, don't you agree that it has to be measured or observed in some way? Not just putting a word on it?
Well, no, I think that goes to certain presuppositions. If you have a presupposition that the material world is all there is, then spirit can't exist. I've already predetermined that the material world is all there is. The biblical view does not make that clear dualistic view. They don't think of God as somewhere like a deistic God, like out there somewhere in the spirit world, not connected to the material world. The biblical view is that God is spirit, but he's also intimately involved in the material world, involved in human beings. They take a meat cleaver between the two. You can't, because human beings are both.
But you're using a word, and I don't know what the word means. And you're using that word in conversation with us, and I don't know what that word actually means. what's the difference between a spirit and just a concept? I mean, does it mean something?
Well, God is a spirit in the sense that he is a personal being. He's not part of creation, but it's part of who he is. It is who he is.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's time. All right, we're to our last question. Dr. Anderson, you'll go first.
All right, the last one.
All right, the question is, can we know certain truths without evidence? And in turn, how can one effectively compare different religions to see which one, if any, are true?
All right. This one, I gotta admit, is a little foggy. Sure. Let's see. Keep going. Got it? All right, yeah. Okay, well, first of all, off with how do you assess different religions, right? Okay, well, in a way, there's different ways. Certain religions make historical claims, and those you can analyze them on historical things. Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, like I said, they don't make historical claims because they don't care about the material world or history, so they can't assess them that way. With Judaism and Christianity and Islam, there are historical claims that you can assess. And for fun, you can talk about the Mormons and Scientology as well. Let's start there. Okay. Mormons claim that there were a tribe of Nephites that came over, to the New World. There's no archaeological evidence for that anywhere. And I'm pretty sure there was no tribe of Nephites ever mentioned in the Old Testament. So when they make that historical claim and there's no historical evidence for it, you can pretty much conclude, probably didn't happen. Okay? Scientologists, I'm sorry, that's just silly. Okay. If you want to see the best takedown of Scientology, watch the South Park episode. Genius. With Western religions, though, there are historical claims made. When you go to the Old Testament in Judaism, there's a lot of debate over the historicity of the Old Testament. I teach a class called Biblical History, and there's a lot of debate over it. And scholars and people come to different conclusions if there's enough evidence for this or that. But the fact is, when you do go to the Old Testament, there's a whole bunch of places and names and people and events that are in history. Okay, maybe not every single thing, but when you go to the Old Testament, there is an Egypt, there is a Canaan. There's all these things that lend credibility to the historical nature. Even a lot of the stuff mentioned regarding Abraham, even though we don't have Abraham's body or anything, but a lot of the customs mentioned in Genesis during the patriarchal period match the customs we find with other ancient Near Eastern writings. So that lends credibility that there's some historical root to it. You go to the New Testament, even more so. Okay. 99.9% of historians and biblical scholars will tell you that there was a historical Jesus who had a messianic movement, who had 12 disciples, who was crucified probably in 30 AD under Pilate, and as a historical fact, shortly after that, his disciples claimed he was resurrected. Okay. Now, I would say, and I've said this to atheists before, you can not believe he was really resurrected. You could believe that claim is false. But if you go so far to say, Jesus didn't really exist, what they call it Jesus mythicism, you have to realize, just, cold-hard truth, that is fringe. Okay? Jesus mythicism is to history, is what flat eartherism is to science. It is bonkers. I know a lot of people are attracted to it and promote it from a historian perspective, from a biblical scholar perspective. Nobody takes that seriously. That's one. Now, as far as Islam goes, I think most people, the historical parts mentioned in Islam about the Prophet Muhammad, who was a real person. He led a group from, he started a group in Medina, They have some battles. Those historical events, pretty much everybody agrees. The question is whether or not the claims are, and this is the second thing, you could address things historically, but then also, for example, and again, I might not be getting this right, I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I remember reading a book on Islam where at one point in the Quran, he mentions how denying the concept of the Trinity, that the Christians believe Jesus, the Son, the Father, and Mary are the Trinity. Well, as a matter of just knowledge, that's not the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, so when the Quran claims that's the doctrine of the Trinity, we know that's wrong. Okay. Another question I would have is, you've probably heard of Muhammad's night ride on the winged horse, probably in 620, it was claimed. The claim was one night he was praying, and an angel appeared to him, and he got on a winged horse, and he flew to Jerusalem, and went into the temple, he met Jesus and Moses, and then a chain came down from heaven, and he stepped on the rock, and he grabbed the chain, he went to heaven, he saw all these mysteries. And if you go to the Dome of the Rock today, there's a rock that says this is the footprint where he actually stepped up. Okay? When I first read that, my first thought was, this claimed to happen in 620. No, there was no Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 620. It was destroyed in 70 AD. So again, as a matter of historical fact, that seemed a little odd. Okay? So the way you can assess different religions, on one hand, is the historical claims there, and there's stuff you can assess. The doctrinal claims, that's a different issue, and I'm out. Okay.
So really, this is two questions in one. Can we know certain truths without evidence? And I guess that's more of a philosophical question. And whether or not you agree with Kant's distinction between analytical truth and synthetic truths, obviously, we can say that it is true that no bachelor is married. That's an analytical truth, which is kind of true by the words themselves, right? But I think when we're talking about actual truth, the only thing that can be true or false is a statement. A rock is not true. A tree is not true. A galaxy is not true. They're reality. But if I say this tree is bigger than a galaxy, well, there's a statement that then you can check. So I think truth, in at least the synthetic sense, when we're talking about a sentence that has any reference to the real world in it, truth is the degree with which a statement corresponds with reality. That's what we mean by truth. And the way to do that is through observation. And another word for that is science. The whole question of the existence of God is a scientific question, not just a metaphysical one, because a universe with a God in it would look different from a universe without a God in it, and we should be able to measure that. We should be able to see that maybe answers to prayer actually are statistically more common than people who don't pray. We should be able to measure things like that, the prophecies and so on. So, but I think the core of your question really has to do with different religions. How do we know if they're true or not? And one thing is certain, all of the religions of the world cannot be true, but they can all be false. That's a possibility. And I guess the most important question you could ask of any religion is it true? Sometimes people give inner experience, and William Lane Craig, when he debates, they say, well, I have an inner knowledge of God, and if you don't, then you're missing out. I debated a Hindu Vedic astrologer in Toronto a few years ago, and he told me, I have an inner experience of the Hindu god Shiva, and I feel it, and if you don't have that, then you're missing out. He keeps using the same argument that Christians use. All religions use this inner experience as if it were some kind of an evidence. Yeah, there is some historical truth in the Bible. There's some historical truth, as Joel pointed out, in the Quran and so on. There's some historical truth in the Bhagavad Gita. But it's more like historical fiction. You look at the novels of James Michener. You will read the novels of James Michener and say, yeah, there was a Hawaii. There was this president. There was a New York City. These places really existed. But does that mean the stories are true? You can tell historical fiction. A lot of the Bible is historical fiction. The Garden of Eden, which Joel is hinting is more of a metaphor than an actuality. It was actually placed in a certain geographical place on the planet between the rivers. Does that mean that the story is actually true because we have some evidence that there was, a place? Any writer is going to make reference to what they know about the world they live in. So what Joel fails to tell us, though, is that the Bible has a lot of historical anachronisms. It has a lot of untruth within it. It has a lot of things that historically, when we check them, for example, when in the year 1500, when they were writing the stories of the patriarchs, which was supposedly 1,000 years or more late in the past, they talked about camel caravans, that the patriarchs, had these camel caravans. We now know from history that domesticated camels were not introduced into that part of the world until around the 10th century, 900 something. They actually kind of know the decade when that happened. So those writers in later were projecting back in history. They made a mistake. They did an anachronism. There's a whole lot of that. That doesn't mean there's not some truth in the Bible. There's contradictions in the Bible. The New Testament has a lot of contradictions. For example, when was Jesus born? If you believe Matthew, Jesus was born under the reign of King Herod. And we know from history that King Herod died in the year 4 BC. So Jesus had to have been born in 4 BC or earlier. But Luke tells us that Jesus was born when Quirinius became governor of Syria, and there was a census that was taken. We know from history that Quirinius became governor of Syria in the year 6 AD. So there's a 9-year gap there. Jesus was 9 years old when he was born, apparently. There are mistakes, there are contradictions in the genealogies there. So yeah, there is some truth, but it's like writing historical fiction. You dress it up with what a lot of the New Testament writers were thinking back, and they got things wrong, but they wanted their readers to think they had some, some credibility. Myth is not the only option for the Jesus story. You've heard people like Josh McDowell say Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. Had to be one of those. But there's a fourth L that he ignores. Even Craig says the same thing, liar, lunatic, or Lord. But there's another L, it's called legend. The Jesus story could be a legend, meaning Jesus may have existed historically. There's a huge difference between the New Testament Jesus and the historical Jesus. A lot of scholars agree, and even a lot of atheists and critics agree that there's a probability that Jesus existed. You can't disprove that. There were other first century messiahs. There was a Theudas the Christ and a Judas the Christ. So there may have been a Yeshua the Christ. You can't say no. But a good analogy would be to ask something like Paul Bunyan. You know the story of Paul Bunyan? With the big blue ox, and he dug the Great Lakes as a watering hole for his ox. This story, was there a real Paul Bunyan? There might have been. There might have been a person. We don't know for sure because the story was written about 40 years later. There might have been an actual big North woodsman with an axe who was fighting with the French against the British and did some heroic deeds. There might have been a historic Paul Bunyan, but the story itself of all this magical stuff that came later is a legendary embellishment, a legendary growth over the historical fact. So I'm willing to concede some probability that there was a historical Jesus. That doesn't mean I'm a mythicist. It means that we can see legendary growth through the New Testament. In fact, if you put the New Testament stories, especially of the resurrection, in chronological order when they were written, you can see the footprint of legendary growth. The earliest stories are simpler. The later stories get more complicated. The later stories in Luke get even more complicated. And by the time you get to John in the year 90 or so, there's these amazing stories. In fact, he says you can't even write a book big enough to contain all the stories. So we see legendary growth. There might have been a historical Jesus, but the Jesus of the New Testament is a cartoon character who did not exist. That character, just like Paul Bunyan, you would say, did not actually, that character in the story didn't exist, although there may have been a person after whom the legend was patterned. So it's not a simplistic black and white thing. So yeah, we do see some history in all of them. That doesn't mean the religion is true, because you can point to some historical context within which these stories happened. And the biggest question is, did the story itself actually happen? Did the miracles actually happen? I don't think Muhammad flew on a winged horse to Jerusalem. And I don't think Jesus fed the 5,000 with a basket of loaves and fish. I think those are stories that were based on the customs of the day. Was if you're going to create a new religion, you had to cut it from the same sort of template of a God-man who came to earth and did miracles and was persecuted by the government, who died and then who came back again. Many, many pagan parallels with similar stories within them. And we see that the Jesus story fits nicely within human creativity, human myth-making. Jesus may have existed. He may have even said some great things, but the New Testament Jesus is a legend.
All right. Guys, you have 5 minutes for a rebuttal.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Just on one specific note, because this has been brought up a lot, Jesus' birth, when it was. Yes, Herod the Great was died 4 BC. A lot of people make a big deal over what Luke says. In the Greek, it is the preposition that is used can easily be translated as Jesus was born before Quirinius' census. And Quirinius was 6 AD. Luke knew about it. He mentions it later in Acts. He's not going to screw that up. And so the apparent contradiction between Jesus' birth isn't a contradiction. In Luke, he's trying to root the birth of Christ in the context of the greater Roman world. He's writing to Greeks. So he's basically saying Jesus was born before Quirinius, the governor of Syria, became governor, which puts it before 680.
So why mention it?
Because if you're a Greek, you want to know who this Jesus is. So he's saying he was born before this guy.
So what, didn't they come to Bethlehem for the census? Isn't that the story? They came for that census.
Well, yeah, but the point here is you said that Luke was contradictory, that he had Jesus born in 6 AD or something. He doesn't have, he's saying that Jesus was born before Quirinius.
When was the census?
The census was during Quirinius' reign.
In 6 AD.
Yeah, and Jesus was born before that.
But didn't Mary and Joseph come to Bethlehem for that census?
That is another issue that you have to understand. The census did not happen all at once. It was a rare, but that's a whole different issue that I don't have my notes for. So,
but you do know that Syria was not even a part of the Roman Empire until 6 AD. There was no need to have a census before that. It became part of the Roman Empire. They needed to count the people at that point.
Okay, well, here's the second point I want to make about just how to understand the Gospels themselves and a lot of the Old Testament stories. Think of the movie Hacksaw Ridge. This is good. Clearly, Hacksaw Ridge was about a historical event, Private Doss, World War II. Mel Gibson, when he did the movie, he used creative license to shape the story. Okay, technically, the thing that got Private Doss to be a conscious objector was not a fight between his mom and his dad. It was this fight between his dad and his uncle. But for some reason, Mel Gibson, I'll just make a better story. Nobody's going to point to that change in the story and say, oh, therefore, World War II never happened, there wasn't a Private Doss who did these things. When you read the Gospels, they are history, but at the same time, they are shaped into have a coherent story, much like a modern movie is about a historical thing, but they shape the story. We do this all the time in movies, and we don't deny the history behind it. You have to allow the biblical writers to use creative license in the telling of history. They weren't newspaper reporters in the 21st century. This is how they wrote. And therefore, you have to realize that.
So you agree there were some contradictions in the Bible?
It was put together using literary creativity, not contradictions. It's just like, different movies about World War II. They're gonna, the producers or not producers, directors, they're going to tell the story in a slightly different way to get their personal.
But Mel Gibson's story contradicts the historical story. That's a contradiction.
Well, are you going to say that there was no Private Doss?
No, but I at least admit there are some contradictions.
But nobody would call it a contradiction.
They both can't be true.
Well, in the telling of the story, you have to allow the writer to use creativity in the telling of the story. And if you go, oh, that's a contradiction, therefore it's not true, you're missing the point of how it's put together.
So which one was true, Matthew or Luke?
They're both true. Jesus was born. And aside of that, what was I going to say? 1 minute. I remember. To go back to some of the things you said earlier. Again, you have to realize that historians and biblical scholars agree that they disagree with Dan saying that he was just a legend. There might have been a historical Jesus back then, but we really don't know anything about it. most 99.9% of historians of biblical scholars will tell you there was a historical Jesus from Galilee. He was considered a prophet. He had a messianic movement. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. All the basic historical facts about you find in the Gospels, 99% of historians and biblical scholars attest to. And so therefore to treat it like, well, there might have been something that we don't know. That's really a misrepresentation of what the majority of historians.
But I'm willing to admit Jesus existed, so that's a
yeah, but then you
that's
say,
a
well,
moot
but I
point.
don't really know anything.
Well,
about it.
I'm willing to admit a probability, but the New Testament Jesus, the Paul Bunyan exaggerated story, did that Jesus exist?
Yes, that's and the way
Really?
you're doing it is a mischaracterization of.
So he walked on water and fed the 5,000. He cast out demons and he did miracles.
He was known.
He did all those things.
The Talmudic Jewish sources acknowledge that he was known as a miracle worker and a healer. He was known at the time.
So that's history.
Again, you might not believe he did it, but that's what he was known for. That's what he was claiming. The point is, Jesus isn't Paul Bunyan. To make that correlation is to misrepresent what the Gospels are actually presenting.
Alright.
Most people, most historians would agree, it's generally historical.
Okay, so now we are going to have some time for questions from the audience. So if you want to raise your hand, if you've got anything to say, ask, you can direct the question to either of our speakers. Yes, sir, back there.
Well, I actually happen to be a witness, so I'm kind of curious. In the Bible, Paul is our earliest source, writing in the 50s, right?
Yeah.
He never attests to a person actually walking. He only asserts that he gets information from visions and scripture. And then if you look in Mark, all throughout that, there are references to scriptures as to say this is the fulfillment of those things. So, what makes you think that he actually walked on earth if our earliest source says that he was just a vision, or and he got his information from scripture?
Yeah. Well, you have to realize Paul's letters are written to specific churches addressing specific things. So if I'm writing a letter to Bob over here about some topic that he's dealing with, I'm not necessarily going to incorporate everything about the topic and just going to address his issue. So Paul isn't giving the full biography of Jesus in his letters because that's not the topic of his letters. And so to say that, there isn't a historical Jesus because he doesn't mention it when he's addressing how proper church worship in Corinth, well, he's not talking about that. He's talking about a different issue. So just the fact that he's not giving the biography of Jesus in his letters, it's a little shaky. So, short and sweet.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Just briefly. Actually, the question does have merit because one of the strong arguments that mythicists do make is the silence of Paul. When he was even talking about things that he could have quoted Jesus, Paul never quoted Jesus. Paul never mentioned any deed of Jesus. If Paul had actually known Jesus personally, then he would have said something about that. In fact, when it comes to divorce, Paul contradicted Jesus on the teaching of divorce. So there is some merit to the mythicists, even though you might want to use an argument from authority and say there's 90-some%. You can't discount it 100%. I think the probability of a historical Jesus is not zero, but I don't think it's very high either. In any event, when he was writing to Corinth, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, Corinth was at least 1,500 miles away as you travel, 25 years after the event. And he's writing these events about, Jesus appeared to Peter and Paul, and then he also appeared to me. So there's no way that any of those people in Corinth would have been able to take that as history. And yet modern apologists take that as a historical fact. Paul was reporting the first report of the resurrection. So, yes, you're right about the numbers of scholars, but the arguments that have been raised about the science of Paul and the pagan parallels and the internal contradictions within the stories, and like the Gospel of Mark shows an amazing similarity, not direct copy, to Homer, to a lot of Homer's writing. You can see a lot of that. So there are strong elements that much of the New Testament, maybe not all of it, maybe there's truth there, but much of it does seem to be copied from ancient literary or pagan sources, which doesn't prove Jesus didn't exist, but it does lower the probability quite a lot, I think. So.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Well, first, thank you for the event. I thought you guys looked great debaters. When I first started the questions, I thought it would be way over, like you guys managed the questions really well. So thanks for that. But my first question is for both of you, which is you hinted at it earlier in the free will debate, but you didn't really get into it very much. Is there a first principle reason that tells me why I ought to care about the harm done to others?
What do you mean by first principle? I mean, that's a...
You said we should care about the harm that we do to other people. That's where we get our morality from. It's whether we should judge an action based on what kind of harm it does to others. Why should I care that others are harmed?
I've never said that we should care. I'm saying that we do care. We do care as biological organisms, averse to harm, averse to, you know, I mean, why should I care that my hand's in a fire? Oh, look at those cells are being damaged, and if I keep my hand in the fire long enough, it's going to compromise the ability to play the piano. I probably should conclude, based on moral philosophy, to withdraw my hand from the fire. It's not that we should do that, it's that we do. We survive because we do. So I'm not suggesting there's some moral ought in the universe. I'm suggesting as evolved physical organisms who we do care about our survival, whether we should or not, we do. And so we can base moral principles on the avoidance or the minimizing of actual harm in the real world.
So that's basically, we can relate others' experiences to how we would react if they were our own, and that's how we...
Empathy.
Empathy, yes.
Did you want to comment on that, Phil?
Well, I think it goes back to something I said earlier. I think, you know, to the morality, when I was rambling on to my first question. The morality, right and wrong is, you know, what is right and wrong is moral, immoral. It does come down to an ought. We don't, like I said, we see a wild animal get tackled by another animal and killed. We don't think, boy, that animal's immoral, because that's just what animals do. That's what, you know, natural processes explain. What is. But when human beings do that, what do we say? Oh, you shouldn't do that. Somehow, when it comes to human beings, we incorporate an ought with human beings and human beings alone. And I think that is significantly different than anything else in the animal kingdom. So, yeah.
But there are times when you say that you should cause harm. If you have to amputate a limb to save a life, you're causing harm to minimize a greater harm. So there.
Well, yeah, well, that, I mean, taking care of a cancer or an amputated limb is slightly different than, you know, typical questions of morality. You know, so-and-so kills this person, we say that is wrong. If an animal kills another animal, we don't say that's wrong. That's just what they do. So if you say human beings are just biological animals, then the very fact that we say, oh, you killed that guy, you're wrong, that is contradicting your claim that human beings are just animals.
We are biological social animals, which adds a whole different dimension to it. So.
How so? Oh.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So you said that, I'm trying to make sure that I'm not misquoting you. You said that we should be able to measure a reality that doesn't have God with like a universe that would have God, right? Is that, I don't know if that's quote for quote, but that's...
Well, yeah, that the existence of God is a scientific question, because if there's a God, there should be some way to know that. And most Christians claim there is. They claim prophecy and miracles and answers to prayer. I mean, the Bible even puts forth a lot of these so-called evidences that the world is different because this God is doing something. So there should be some way to observe, test. I mean, any scientist in the world would love to prove the existence of a hitherto unknown force in the cosmos. By now, someone should have won the Nobel Prize for proving that prayer actually works better than random chant. I mean, really, if that's true, if these statements are true, there should be some measurable way to see it rather than just using words.
Yeah, but in scientific experiment, you'd have a control group where both sides are looking at the same reality, so you wouldn't be able to say, oh, well, here's reality where God exists, here's reality where he doesn't, what's the difference? Like, you can't see that because we're both looking at the.
You could look at a population of patients and have a lot of people pray, extra prayer for this population, and this population not, and compare the results. You could do a test like that. You could have a control group of the people. Of course, there's no way to know who's being prayed for or not because grandma and everybody's praying for everybody. But if you could show that this group, under a controlled experiment, actually had a statistically significant survival rate that was better than this group, then that would be evidence, maybe not of a God, but it would be evidence of the efficacy of prayer. So something like that, you know.
That has been done. I'll be glad to show you.
It's been done, and it's actually prayer comes out worse in many cases.
No.
Yes, it has.
No.
If you're right, then somebody should be winning the Nobel Prize for that, because you know what? That would change everything. That would change medicine. That would change science. Somebody should go for that and prove it. There have been studies on both sides, and you know what happens with the file drawer effect? A lot of these studies are done, and there's a slight advantage that's given. They get into the media, but sometimes when the prayer group does worse, you don't hear about those. In fact, we have evidence of that actually happening. And there was one study of intercessory prayer on the success rate of alcohol recovery, and the scientist was a believing Christian, and he was praying, and it turns out that the group that was prayed for did worse, so he hid the results. But he was funded by a federal grant, so he had no choice but to actually publish them, and it turned out he had to publish that the group that was prayed for did statistically worse than the group that didn't. So you can find studies on both sides. I bet you could come up with 5 or 8 studies that show some slight advantage, but you can come up with others that show others. So, and think about what you're saying. If you're right, it changes everything. It does. I would go back to preaching again if you're right. So somebody should do that. Someone should prove it. Somebody should actually win the Nobel Prize for pointing out, look at this. Here's this. We wouldn't need hospitals anymore. We could just believe the Bible. The prayer of faith will save the sick. All things whatsoever ye shall ask for in my name believing, you shall receive, the Bible says. Let's see if that actually works out in reality. So far, it doesn't.
But wait, we live in a secular society, so even if you prove it, somebody's going to say, oh no, there's a flaw. They're not going to want to believe it because you're trying to prove one thing. There's always going to be an outro perspective.
Well, there'll be criticism, yeah. But I mean, that's an ad hominem.
That's Nobel Peace Prize for it.
Nobel Prize in Science, yeah, a Nobel Prize. Yeah, but science is blind to that. I mean, there have been scientific theories that have been overturned. There have been doubters. There have been contradictions. There have been plate tectonics is one example, and the mass of neutrinos is another example. There's all sorts of examples of science correcting itself with more science. So I wouldn't use an ad hominem argument that secular society is opposed to an actual reality. That would be amazing. If there's a better way to heal people than medicine, I would go for it. I would believe in it. I'm a secular person, and I would embrace it if science came up with it. So I think it's kind of a cheap shot to use an ad hominem to say that we're ignoring the truth of prayer.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So just to tag onto that and then move to something completely different. As someone in a major that involves science, just me thinking here in the last 5 minutes, that I see almost impossible to control for the whole prayer thing, like all the different things. You mentioned, hey, grandma was praying for everybody, so that would be very hard to study. That's my only comment on that. But 2, I would like to press on the free will discussion, the free will question. The presupposition of that question is that there is a God, whether you believe it or not, okay? And Mr. Margaret, I think that in your assessment of free will, you kind of put God in a box to say, like, in my mind, this is how I kind of see it, and I'm sure, I'm no theologian, I'm no professional debater, I'm 22 years old, right, so I'm sure it's a lot here, but if God is God, then kind of the definition of that is he's utterly, and he kind of has understandings and abilities outside of what our mind contains. And so if God can see eternity as a whole, right, he can see us in our time now, right, make the decisions and just know the decisions we're going to make. It doesn't hold us to that. He just knows that. It's like looking at a timeline, like in my history book, right? Like those things happen based on those people's free will choices. But I can tell you, like if I had a time machine to go back, I could tell you, hey, this is what happened based on these people's free will choices.
Yeah, well, yeah, good point. But my FANG argument has nothing to do with human free will. It has to do with the assumption that this God itself has free will. And a big answer that people sometimes give in response to my argument is that, well, God exists outside of time, right? Well, that's not coherent. To exist means to be measurable in some way. And so how can something exist? How can God have a thought? I mean, all of the descriptions of this God are defined in temporal terms. When God decided to create the universe, wasn't there an antecedent part of his brain that was before that? So
I think you're still falling into that same misconception that you have in that idea, right? That God is outside of our understanding. If God just is, which I think is part of the definition of God, he doesn't need an antecedent. He doesn't have to have a brain like we have a brain, understanding those types of things. You're still putting this understanding of God in the understanding of how a human operates. Yes, there's temporal, because it would say that the eternal has brought its influence on the physical, or something of that nature. But like, you're still, I don't know, putting God in your own terms.
Well, I have no choice. I mean, it's like, maybe God doesn't need an answer, but I do. It's like that story of the student maybe he was in your class. The student wrote on the test, I don't know the answers to these questions, but God does. And so the professor turned it back in and said, God gets an A, you flunked. Right? So you're not answering anything by saying that. You're just positing God knows.
I would say you're not answering anything.
But I defined free will pretty clearly as an indecisiveness about your future actions. Whether you think we have it or not, that's what free will would mean. And God would have no indecisiveness about any future actions. Therefore, he would have no indecisiveness because he knows what he's going to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there you go. So then, by that definition, God, whatever else qualities he has, does not have free will. That's what I'm saying.
Does God have free will? Does man have free will?
But that wasn't my point. Fang has to do with God's free will. The human free will is a different question. I'm sorry, I'm taking up too much time.
All right, that's good.
This will have to be.
But maybe Joe wanted to say something about it.
To tag on to, John's outside of time. Again, this goes back, you can go back to Greek philosophy, the idea of the world of forms and the world of particulars. The problem with what you're saying about God doesn't have free will and stuff is you're still putting him within the box of nature. You're treating him like a creature within the created order, and you're kind of denying the very thing that makes God God. So that's what I would add.
Yeah, this will have to be our last question because we have run over a little bit.
I appreciate this, but when we try to describe God, we have to describe him in terms that we understand. The only thing we understand is himself. In every religion, God is described with human terms. Never can be described outside of human terms because we have no concept. We have to describe him.
And the Bible does too. The Bible describes God in temporal terms. He makes decisions, he grieves, he loves, he repents, he changes his mind sometimes. So if you're looking through the window of the Bible, you see God as a temporal being. He makes decisions and he makes judgments in real time. And if God's more than that, well, that's just a hypothesis. God might be more than that, but in any event, we can only understand what we understand. And if he's going to communicate to me, he's going to have to communicate to me in a language that I understand. You just can't say God is blistered little flop-wop. You can't do that. You have to use terms that make sense to me, or I don't get it.
You never heard that. Honestly, we have to use language that we understand, and we're trying, the whole idea of talking about God, you have to use language that's limited. But you have to realize you're using language that's limited, and ultimately, you can't, and again, you see this throughout the New Testament, the early church fathers, all language we use to try to describe God is the best we can comprehend, but there's always a knowledge that there's ultimately something more that we cannot comprehend. And so there's that tension. So you can't just say, oh, it's just the natural world. He has to be part of the natural world, and it's not God.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for attending. Thank you to our speakers, Dan Barker and Dr. Anderson. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I'm sure everyone else did.
I'll be sticking around a little later if you want to chat with me. I can assess my thoughts.
But I guess we are adjourned. That's the term I'll use. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, yes. If you would like to speak to Dr. Anderson or Dan Barker about the books that they have outside of the door here, they'll be down here.
Yes. Okay, now off the stage.
If the afterworld is a resurrection physical, what is heaven? Do they?
Okay, this will be awesome.
And my dad is very adamant on being there for that very reason.
Well, I think a lot of the reasons prove that too. Okay, basically, the biblical view, the New Testament is, let's say I die today. Obviously, before Jesus comes again, you have to know Christ. In some sense, and again, there's only so much I can say, in some sense you can call it heaven, you're with Christ, but you're not, that's not the end game. It's kind of a holding point. Then when the new creation happens, the idea that that's true. And as far as hell is concerned, that's another issue. People have different views. I view it as basically, I lean toward annihilationism, where if you do here for eternal life, you will lose life. If you don't, you lose life. And hell is like taking out the trash. I don't think it was eternal torment on
Reincarnated though, could you be resurrected?
Yeah, I think again, it's a mystery. Yeah, well, it's a mystery how it would happen. But the idea would be that he's going to recreate.
So theoretically, a heaven above us and a hell below us doesn't exist.
I think we use those terms like metaphorically. I don't think there's like Jesus is literally sitting on top of the world.
Yeah.
I think we
I
have.
feel like that's the global life.
Well,
That's what you always.
I think we speak in metaphors all the time, and we just have to realize, we have the vision of us on fire. Really, but how else would we describe it? That's the frustrating thing I have, especially with the library. There's so much more background that you know to get to the question, and I just love through it. So, kind of.